Well, in your new book, Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, How Britain Lost Its Empire and the West Lost the World, you trace the origins of World War II back to World War I and prior to World War I, which is not necessarily new information, but Germany invaded Belgium first.
Oh yeah, there's no question.
Before any...
Oh, I don't deny that. Germany violated Belgian neutrality. And look, Germany made enormous blunders in World War I.
And this is back in 1914.
1913, 1914. I don't exonerate the Germans of all responsibility, and even at Versailles, they said, we do not say we are not partly responsible for this war, but we do not bear full moral culpability for it. The great blunder of the Germans was to give the Kaiser a war guarantee. This is one of the keys to my book, a blank check to Austria to punish the Serbs who had assassinated their Archduke. And the Austrians were right. The assassination of the Archduke was by a fanatic, but he had ties to Serbian intelligence, clearly ties to the top of Serbian intelligence. And the Austrians took the blank check and held it for 4 weeks before they issued the ultimatum to Serbia. If they had moved right away, all of Europe would have understood, but they held it for 4 weeks until the Russians got into the idea that this is they're moving on Serbia, our little brothers, our allies. And the Kaiser, at the end of this process, in late July, he was desperate to try to pull it back. So was the Tsar, so was King George V. So, quite frankly, were all the monarchs of Europe. Franz Joseph were trying to pull back, but there were very hard men in every camp. And the hardest of them all in England was Winston Spencer Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty. Sir Edward Grey had committed Britain secretly to war for France in any event, even if the Germans had not gone through Belgium. But the one who was really just disconsolate when he thought Sir Edward Grey might pull together a meeting of ambassadors and avert war was Winston Churchill.
Okay. You've mentioned a couple names here. Who is David Lloyd George? Lloyd George
is probably, certainly he's one of the 2 greatest prime ministers of the 20th century. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the putative or successor to Asquith, who was Prime Minister in 1914. And Lloyd George is an incredible character. In the Boer War, he had been an anti-war liberal, and he had been crucified for it. And his party had taken a terrible beating. But he was a great hero. He's an extraordinarily talented man. He's not up to Churchill's level in terms of Churchill as a writer, but as a politician, he was in many ways superior. He could bring people together. And in the middle of World War I, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, Asquith government fell, and he came into power in 1916 and formed a coalition government with the Tories, and he led the British to victory in World War I. He represented the British Empire at the Versailles Conference, and objective observers said even Lord Kane said, Lloyd George was head and shoulders above any of the other Allied leaders, basically Clemenceau and Wilson and Orlando. And he came home from Versailles the big winner. All the German ships were given to him, even though they committed suicide at Scapa Flow. He had the German merchant fleet. He had the underseas cables. He had new colonies in Africa. He had the parts of the Ottoman Empire. He had parts of the British Empire, excuse me, the German Empire in the South Pacific. He had all these reparations. He made the Germans pay reparations for pensions of the British soldiers because Great Britain had been unharmed, and so the French would have gotten all the reparations because it was torn to pieces, Northwest. And so he said, no, we got to include pensions in here. And Wilson, to convince Wilson, who hated him, Wilson just hated Lloyd George. Lloyd George got Smuts, the ambassador of South Africa, or not the ambassador, the prime minister, Jan Smuts. And he went and convinced Wilson. And so Wilson signed on to the pensions, and the Americans, who were very honorable at that conference and idealistic, who wanted an honorable peace, they were sickened and enraged with Woodrow Wilson. Sickened and enraged.
Self-determination. Woodrow Wilson's self-determination, you talk about that.
Wilson got into the war after he won the election in 1916. His party ran on the platform, he kept us out of war. And what happened was, again, no one's trying to exonerate the Kaiser and the German General Staff of responsibility, their responsibility for the war. What the Kaiser had done was the Germans, and again, Churchill, had imposed a starvation blockade on Germany, a high seas blockade rather than a close-in blockade. These were violations of international norms of conduct in warfare. You didn't starve women and children. Lord Salisbury said, we're not going to do that to the Boers. If the food's going to the women and children and families, we got to let it go through. We'll stop it if it's going to their army. But Churchill imposed the starvation blockade on Germany, so the Germans retaliated with submarines. But the submarines sank the Lusitania off the Irish coast in April 1915, and there's a lot of conspiracy theories about what Churchill did, that he put it in the way of the Germans. 128 Americans were killed, 1,000 people. And Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt and a lot of the Americans were demanding, get into the war. And I give Wilson credit. He stayed out of the war, but they did warn the Germans. And so the Germans called off this unrestricted submarine warfare. But what happened, you're getting to 1917 now, and the German General Staff meets with the Kaiser. And they met with him and said, look, the Americans, if we begin submarine warfare, the Americans are liable to come in, but the Americans are unarmed. They got 17th largest army in the world. They're sitting on the other side of the Atlantic. There's no more harm they can do to us than they're doing now. They're shipping all this stuff to the Brits. Give us 6 months with these submarines and we'll knock the Brits out of the war, they told the Kaiser. And the Kaiser okayed it. And the German Prime Minister, Bethmann Hollweg, he tried to convince otherwise, but he said, I can't argue with the generals and admirals. And as they all walked out of the room, he said, Finis Germaniae, the end of Germany. And that's what happened. The British held the Germans, and they held them in the offensive of 1918, Ludendorff's final great offensive that reached the Marne. And the Americans, frankly, won the war. They were the decisive force. By the spring and summer of 1918, 250,000 American troops a month were pouring into the lines. The German lines were breaking, their morale was down, the Austro-Hungarian Empire wanted out of the war, and so that's when the Germans sued for peace. And that's the beginning of a lot of the problems. See, the Germans had won the war against Russia, and they won the war against Romania, and they had imposed a peace on the Russian Empire, on Lenin's empire, which was in the interest of the West. They had torn Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, all these countries out of Lenin's empire and set them free. And so to get back to the fundamental point, what I'm getting at is, it was the Kaiser's ambitions were global. He had a world policy. He had a world fleet, the high seas fleet. He had colonies around the world. He wanted to be treated on a par with Great Britain. And one of the causes of the war was, of course, his own mindset and the fact that the British treated him with such contempt.
Sir Edward Grey, who is he?
Sir Edward Grey is the foreign minister of Great Britain for 10 years, who is probably the man most responsible for Britain's entry into World War I, because it was he who told Haldane, or approved Haldane's plan for secret military talks with France following up on their Entente of 1904, which was designed to solve their colonial quarrels. In Egypt, the French had claims on the canal, and in Morocco, the British had claims there. They traded them off, and that was to settle colonial quarrels. And Sir Edward Grey and Haldane got together and said, let's start secret military talks to commit the British to send an army of 115,000 troops to France within 2 weeks of a war with Germany if it happens. This is almost 10 years before the war, 1905, January 1906. And frankly, it was the arrival of the British Expeditionary Force, the greatest little army in the world, that stopped the German army on its big sweep through Belgium, which was going to come around and encircle the French. One German general, the German generals thought the British were firing machine guns. So effective were their riflemen from what they had learned in the Boer War. They could open and fire those guns perfectly, 15 rounds a minute. And all of these soldiers, they were colonial soldiers, and it was a tiny army. But it was, I think, man for man at that point, the finest army in the world, and it stopped the German invasion of France.
Pat Buchanan, you tell the story about July 1914, a regatta, or
This was June 1914.
June 1914, in a regatta in Germany.
Sure.
And what happened then?
Well, what was wonderful about this was the Germans had challenged the British with a high seas fleet. They were building a great fleet in their Kiel in Wilhelmshaven. And this enormous fleet they were building was to rival the British fleet, and the Kaiser was responsible. And they kept building it up, and von Tirpitz was the architect of it. He came in 1896 under the Kaiser. And they wanted to challenge the British fleet. And they said, in the event of war, we want to be able to do so much damage to them, the Brits won't fight us. And of course, this made the British understandably paranoid. In the Baltic Sea, 400 miles away, is the greatest fleet on earth besides their own. So they bring all these warships home from the rest of the world. And that's what brought the Brits into alliance with Russia and France, who were their colonial rivals. So it was a stupid thing. But in 1913, Tirpitz gave it up. His rival over, incidentally, was the First Lord of the Admiralty then, young Winston Churchill. And so the Germans were building dreadnought for dreadnought almost until they gave up. In 1913, Tirpitz said, we will accept 60% of the British Royal Navy, and we can't compete with the British and keep up our army and protect ourselves from the Russians who are building up in Poland, which was part of Russia then, and the French army, which is the finest in the world. So they stopped, and so the Kaiser was Queen Victoria's grandson. He regularly used to come over to England and race, and he won a race there, and his uncle, Edward VII, detested the Kaiser. It was Willie. He had no respect for his nephew. And Willie came over and won a regatta over there. And I think Edward never again went to one of those regattas. But what they were having, this is late June 1914. The British Navy sends over this mighty squadron with the King George V, their brand new battleships, Ajax and all these dreadnoughts. They go into the harbor. The Tirpitz takes them aboard the finest German battleships. The Kaiser gets on his uniform of the British Admiralty, visits George V. They're having parties. Prince Henry brings the British officers in. They're meeting the girls. It's a wonderful time. And they're having their regatta. And a boat on the 28th or 29th, right around then, sails out, a small boat, to the Kaiser's ship. He's racing on his Meteor. It's the name of his boat. And says they've assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand, who was a great friend of the Kaiser's, and whom the Kaiser looked forward to seeing run the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Franz Joseph was probably in his 80s. He had been in since 1848. And so the Kaiser, everything appalled, went over it. And the British, of course, got on their warships, and the regatta was closed down, and the British and the Germans sent the signal, safe voyage home to England. And the British warship, I believe, sent back the signal, friends now, friends in future, friends forever. And these were the two greatest navies on earth. And that's the situation when the Archduke was assassinated. 6 weeks later, the two countries are slaughtering each other in the fields of France. Unbelievable. Or 8 weeks later.